Good morning to everyone there in Sydney, and good afternoon to everyone here in Mexico. I would like to welcome all of you. My name is Roberta Lopez Zamora, and I'm a member of the Youth Network El Faro from the global firm El Faro Luz y Ciencia. Today, we continue with the cycle of interviews with international organizations about the 2030 agenda. In this occasion, we have Professor Quentin Grafton as our guest. From part of the Youth Network El Faro, we welcome you, Professor. And before we start, I will allow myself to share a bit of your profile. Okay, so Professor Quentin Grafton is Professor of Economics, convener of the Walter Justice Hub, and Director of the Center for Water Economics, Environment and Policy at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. In April 2010, he was appointed to the chairholder in the UNESCO Chair in Water Economics and Transboundary Water Governance, and between August 2013 and July 2014, he served as Executive Director of the Australian National Institute of Public Policy. He currently serves as the Director of the Food, Energy, Environment and Water Network.
Well, UNESCO has a very small budget, which has got smaller in the recent past. So in terms of being able to manage the huge need, it has only been able to make some progress. It's a global effort that requires not only UNESCO, but not other UN organizations, but also other development organizations and other governments to be involved. And as you're familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, quite a number of them will not be achieved by 2030, and certainly not at the current trends that we're going through. Water, of course, SDG 6 is one that will not be achieved. Just not my opinion. There's been recent work looking at that, at current trends, that we're not going to achieve water for all in terms of potable water, in terms of water and sanitation and health. Water. So we've got very large numbers of people in 2020, more than 2 billion who don't have access to what I would consider to be potable water, and possibly 4 billion plus in terms of what I would consider to be well-managed water and sanitation health facilities. So we're clearly where there's a huge goal. What UNESCO is doing, well, UNESCO has been in the water space for decades. It's primarily focused in the context of research and development, which it has supported. It has also had particular progress in the context of transboundary issues as well as groundwater, and tries to bring in together different players in terms of that mix of how we can bring about the progress that we need. So in terms of the details about what UNESCO has achieved and what it will achieve, that's best addressed to UNESCO officials who would have all those details at their fingertips. But there's no question UNESCO has helped and is continuing to help despite a very limited budget. Well, there's a huge role here to play by UNESCO and many other organizations and governments. And I think the biggest role of all is in terms of governance. So that's not to say that WASH, water, sanitation and health, or potable water aren't a priority. Clearly they are a number one priority, but how do you get from A to B? How do you bring about? Well, it's not just the expenditure, which clearly is important. It's not just the resources, it's how it gets done. And there's been an ongoing failure in terms of water, in terms of how it's governed, how it's managed, and decisions are made around water. And so I think there are real gaps in water governance at a global scale, and of course at individual countries and regions and catchments. The OECD, a sister organization in the sense it's also UN and based in Paris, has highlighted a series of water governance principles in terms of the sorts of things that should be done. So I think it's quite clear that what it should be done, and the question is how does it get done? And I think that's the multi-billion-dollar question. And I've been struggling here in Australia, which is, as your listeners will know, is a rich country, trying to get the Australian government to actually sign it could follow up, I should say, on what it signed up to in terms of these water governance principles, and indeed to principles that the collectively Australian governments have signed up to in what it's called in Australia the National Water Initiative, series of principles about how we should manage water. So there's a huge disconnect between what we say we should do and what we actually do. And that disconnect means that money doesn't get well spent, money gets misdirected to where it shouldn't go, and money that should be put into priority areas doesn't actually get put into priority areas. So it may be surprising to some of your listeners, but there are in fact thousands of Australians that don't have access to what you or I would consider to be acceptable drinking water. Thousands of Australians. And that varies according to time of year and the context of droughts, etc. But that is unacceptable in a country as rich as Australia. So clearly there has to be a governance failure for that to happen. The ability to do it, the resources are absolutely there. So that is just a microcosm of the sorts of things that I'm talking about. So we lots of programs, but again, I think you should direct those questions to UNESCO, because although I'm a UNESCO shareholder, I don't get paid by UNESCO. I work at the Australian National University, so I don't want to do a disservice to UNESCO in terms of the details of which they would clearly have at their fingertips to give you that. But the UNESCO has played an important role over, I don't know how many decades now, 4 or 5 decades, at least in the context of 5 decades, I think, in the context of water. For example, I'm a shareholder. There are, in terms of water, I don't know the exact number now, but it's 35, maybe 40, possibly more shareholders. And that's an initiative of UNESCO where we try and link among ourselves. That's an R&D, that's a research and development type of exercise. UNESCO led an important activity in 2017, in July 2017, and in Geneva, in the context of bringing shareholders together, doing the science in some sense with the humanities, with the social sciences together to try and respond to some of these big issues, as you point out, SDG 6 and the other SDGs. So yeah, UNESCO certainly is trying and doing in a number of dimensions. But again, I would urge you to contact UNESCO rather than myself. They're the ones who should tell you what UNESCO is doing, not myself. Well, water economics is a discipline or a sub-discipline of economics, which studies how water is allocated, both in an optimal sense and what actually does happen, and tries to understand well, it could be water markets or other approaches to water pricing, for example, to see how you can get better outcomes. And that's essentially what water economics, in a practical sense, what it tries to do. So I am a water economist, and part of what I've been doing is looking at water markets, and in particularly in Australia. And they have had some success in terms of providing better benefits, higher benefits in times of drought, because water is able to be directed from lower to higher end uses. That said, however, water markets are not the be all and end all, in the sense that they are not going to be able to deliver a whole range of different outcomes. So I convene what's called the Water Justice Hub, and water justice is around three areas. One is basic justice, which that we talked about in terms of basic human water needs and potable water and wash. The second form of justice is distributed justice, which is really, it goes back to Aristotle at least, and that's really about a fair share for all. And then the third aspect was procedural justice, which is about, do people who get affected by decisions related to water, are they part of the people who are listened to, are given voice and given a respected seat at the table? So those basic distributive and procedural justice issues are not going to be resolved by water markets. Okay, so if it's basic water justice, it requires intervention, typically by public entities or aid the donor agencies. If it's outside of Australia, for example, that's not going to happen with water markets. If it's distributive justice, markets don't have a it's all based on who has the funds, who has the highest value in use. So that's not about a fair share. It's about those who have the greatest return from water gets the water. So if you want distributed justice, you need to intervene in the context of who gets the initial allocations or water. And then procedural justice, well, water markets need to be regulated, and that regulation and indeed a lot of decisions about water don't involve the people who are affected by it. So the justice dimensions aren't accounted for in water markets, although water markets, as I've said, can and have delivered benefits in the context of Australia. So there's multiple dimensions that have to be responded to beyond the standard water markets or water pricing or whatever it might be. The transboundary issues, I focus more on that in the context of Australia, but the transboundary issues are fundamental to delivering SDG 6 in a range of dimensions, and certainly that is a focus of UNESCO, where there are multiple agreements, particularly around rivers in the world, that some of them have been quite successful and some not. But clearly we have transboundary issues because there's not enough water to go around, and so upstream countries or regions have a tendency to want to dam and control the water, which therefore disadvantages downstream users, including the environment. And so getting that mix right is really about this distributive justice, and it's an ongoing challenge. It's not going to disappear. It requires a whole range of different interventions to not only get the dialogue, but to get outcomes as well. So you mentioned water economics, you mentioned transboundary. I mean, and I've also mentioned to you in response water justice, there are multiple dimensions to water across a range of ways of thinking about it in both the disciplinary research sense, but also in a practical sense. And I think part of the problem we've had in the world is that water has been put into little silos. So, you know, you have the hydrology silo, you have the civil engineering silo, you have the economic silo, whatever it is. And instead of putting them together and thinking about how do they all put together, and this gets back to this point I made earlier about the theory of change. You know, if you want to get outcome A, whatever that is, and let's say SDG 6, water for all by 2030, well, you're going to have to put all of this mix together. It's not just about dollars that are being spent. It's also about how it's being spent and the governance around that. So you've got to put all of that together. That's everything. So it's complex. It's obviously a challenge, but that has got to be what we need to do, and it's far too rare to get that sort of thinking, and not just in a research context. I mean, even in the public-private and the non-profit sectors as well, that we don't get the dialogues that are needed and understanding that's needed to make practical steps forward. There's multiple challenges, but one challenge I think is information. So it depends where you are in the world, of course, but you know, in some parts of the world, you have disputes about actually where the headwaters are of important river systems. So if you dispute about where the headwaters are, you're clearly going to have a problem downstream about when you try to manage it. There's disputes about the stream flows, what actually those stream flows are, both upstream at the border or wherever they are. There's disputes about what people are taking, as in extractions. So I would argue, at least the first step, it's by no means sufficient, but I think in all of these cases, having good information that's pretty much understood and accepted by all parties is a firm basis for a dialogue. So in other words, we can use remote sensing as well as other types of measurements on the ground combined in terms of calibrating the remote sensing to be able to get that information and put it on the table, make it transparent, And at least that forms the basis of a discussion. It's not going to resolve the fact that a country A might want to extract more water and then country B wants it to, but at least you can have a dialogue. Well, we know how much you're extracting. If we want to change that to something else, we can at least know we're starting from a basis of at least the facts. Not if you dispute the facts from the very beginning, you can't even have a proper discussion. There's no point about it. So I think UNESCO is uniquely placed to be able to engage not only through UNESCO shareholders, but in terms of the what it's been doing and its international hydrological program for many decades to aid and support that in terms of water information. That I think is that key step forward. It's that, but as I said, not sufficient. It won't resolve the problems by itself, but it's a good step forward, and I think that's something where UNESCO could and should be supported to deliver hopefully better outcomes on a transboundary level.